So at this point, most of you, I'm sure, know that we are in a series that we've entitled Stories from the Bible. Most of these stories come from the Old Testament. And the purpose of this series is that we want to look back in time and look at the stories of the people who were living for God in ancient times. Because what we see in those stories, even though many of us who were raised in church, we were told these stories in Sunday school. When we were told the stories in Sunday school, they were given to us in the context that was appropriate for a child. But the truth is that these are not children's stories. They are stories for adults. They are stories that talk about the struggle of God's people throughout time. They talk about their struggles both personally and in their families, and they also talk about their struggles on a political level, a societal level, their struggles with other nations and so forth. And so all of those things speak to us today. Humans today have all of these same struggles. And so what we want to do is see ourselves in the pages of these stories and ask ourselves, who are we in these stories? And what values and principles do we emulate? Do we make the same mistakes? Or do we learn from these mistakes? And so that's the purpose of this. And we've been reading and going through some of these stories now for, I think it's 3 weeks now. And so you'll remember a couple of weeks ago, I talked to you about David, King David. And we told the story of David and Goliath and how when he was a young man, he was just a young shepherd boy, he went out and he faced Goliath, who was the champion for the Philistine army and was challenging the armies of God and saying, send one man down, and see if he can defeat me. And they were all frightened by him. And of course, you know the story that David went out and was able to defeat him with a sling. And so today, the story that we're going to talk about is David now, many years later, he is now the king of Israel. And he has, by all accounts, he's been a great king. And in fact, to this very day, people, Hebrew Jewish people look back on King David as the epitome of the great king of Israel. And so that's how he's seen. And today, though, when we read this story, what we talked about last week with David and Goliath, we see him as a hero. Today, we're going to see some of the chinks in his armor. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. So let me begin by telling you this story of David and Bathsheba. And this is one that maybe you didn't hear in Sunday school because it's a little harder to put in the context for children. But the story of David and Bathsheba, if you know the story at all, basically you can read about it in 2 Samuel, starting in the 11th chapter. And the story of King David and Bathsheba begins with David one evening just getting up. Apparently he couldn't sleep, and he's walking on the roof of his palace, and he looks down, and he sees a woman who is bathing. And he looks upon her, and he realizes she's beautiful. She's just stunningly beautiful. And so he sends somebody to inquire about this woman and who she is. And so one of his men went, and he came back, and he said, David, this is this young woman that you asked about. Her name is Bathsheba. And she is the wife of Uriah the Hittite. And Uriah was a soldier in David's army. And it so happened that at that time, the army was waging this campaign against the Ammonites. And they won that battle and that war. But this was during the time that war was taking place. And Uriah was there with the armies of God, with the armies of Israel in this campaign. And so David decided that he wanted Bathsheba. And so he sent one of his men to go get her, and they went and got her, and they brought her to the palace. And essentially, David he had his way with her. And in those days, what you have to understand is that just like when we talked about the story of Esther and King Xerxes, these kings in those days had unbelievable power. They could do anything that they wanted, basically. And so when King David sent for Bathsheba and she came to the palace, she was just in a position where she basically had to do whatever the king wanted. And that included spending the night with him. And so that's exactly what happened. David just simply had his way with her. She spent the night and he sent her home. So it turned out that sometime after that, though, Bathsheba sent word to King David that, I'm pregnant with your child. So David is thinking to himself, okay, what am I going to do about this? And he comes up with a plan. And his plan is pretty simple. He just calls Joab, who is one of the leaders, one of the generals of his army. Uriah was under Joab, and he said to Joab, hey, send me Uriah back home because I want to talk to him. I want him to tell me about how the campaign is going on and so forth. And so he comes home, and so David talked with him, says, how are things going, and then he says, hey, you're a great soldier. Thank you for the message. This is basically what's happening here. And so then he says, so now, you've been a great soldier. Go home to your wife, wash your feet, take it easy for a while. And he sends him home, and he even sends a gift after him. So you understand, of course, what David's plan was here. What David's plan was I'll bring Uriah home. And when he gets home, of course, he's been off to war for a long time. He is going to want to be with his wife. And so I'll bring him home. I'll send him to his house, and he'll make love to his wife. And so then when it turns out that she's pregnant, he'll just think that it's his child. This was David's plan. But something went wrong. Because David, after he talks to Uriah, he sends Uriah home, but Uriah doesn't go home. He goes down to the palace doors, and there he sleeps with the palace guards. He lays his mat out, and he sleeps there with the palace guards. And the next day, some of the men came to David, and they said, Uriah didn't go home. He didn't go home. And so David calls him in. He says, Uriah, haven't you just been out at war for a long time? I've called you home. I sent you home. Why would you not go home? And Uriah says, all of my fellow soldiers are out fighting a war. All of them are sleeping in the open field in tents. And none of them are home with their wives. How could I go and eat and drink in my home and make love to my wife when all of my fellow soldiers are out laying in a field? He said, as surely as you live, king, I will not do such a thing. So Uriah's integrity, you see, got in the way of David's wickedness. So David had to do something about that. So David has him stay another day, and he has him come and eat dinner with him. And as he's eating dinner with him, he serves him a lot of wine. And David gets Uriah drunk on wine, thinking, I'll get him drunk. Once he's drunk, I'll send him home then, and in his drunkenness, he'll sleep with his wife then. So David gets him drunk, but sure enough, even though he was drunk on wine, he goes and he sleeps out there at the palace gates along with the guards. He still doesn't go home. And so Uriah's integrity just seemed steadfast. He just could not go against his character and his integrity and do the thing that David was hoping that he would do. And so David's in a pickle. So what is he to do? So he says to Uriah, okay, I'm going to send you back now, back to Joab, so you can go and rejoin the battle. Here, I want you to take this letter to Joab. And he gives him a sealed letter. And in the letter, David writes to Joab, put Uriah in the front lines where the battle is the fiercest, and then withdraw, leaving him there to be struck down. And he sends Uriah off back to Joab with this letter in his own hand. Unbeknownst to Uriah, he is taking a letter from his Lord, his king, whom he trusts, whom he loves, and whom he is fighting for on the battlefield. And in this letter, he is carrying for the king is the betrayal of the king that he is serving. He brings the letter to Uriah, and Uriah opens the letter, and Joab opens the letter, and he puts Uriah on the front lines, and sure enough, he's killed. that chapter ends with, "But this did not please the Lord." Now, I want to talk to you a little bit about that. Because, 2 weeks ago when we talked about David as the young shepherd who went out and fought. He went out and fought Goliath. You understand that here David, he was looking at this guy and he said, this guy, he's insulting the armies of God. He's insulting the Israel army. He's insulting the people, my people. And he had pride for his people and the people of God. And all throughout the scriptures, as you read about David, it's very clear that he had a passion for God. And he had a passion for the people of Israel. And he took pride in the people of Israel. And that was true all the way back when he was a shepherd boy, when he was willing to go and fight a giant that nobody else in the armies of Israel was willing to fight. He could not stand by and allow them to be insulted. He was willing to go and fight. He had that much trust in God and that much pride in his people. And that is the makings of a fantastic leader. That is the makings of a king that would be great. And in many ways, David was a great king. But here we read this story of Uriah and David and what David did. And as you read this story and you ponder to yourself, especially to Western ears today in the 21st century, this seems just unforgivable. And let me just say to you that there is something that is true about human beings. Human beings live with both good and evil in them at the same time. That is a fact about people. People are both good and bad at the same time. They have good motivations and they have evil motivations living inside them at the same time. And here's something that's interesting. The more good that you do, the more passionate you are about doing the right thing, and the more you accomplish that, the more temptation you will also have to act on some of the evil desires living inside you. Here's why. This is especially true of people in power, like King David. People who have power or prestige or wealth, this is especially true of them, and here's why. The more successful you are at being righteous, the more successful you are at doing the right thing, or being a great leader, or being somebody who is in power, the more successful you are at that, the more your pride begins to well up in you. And it's very easy to get to a place where that you believe that because of your acts of righteousness, because you've been more successful than other people at doing the things of God, which is what David had to believe about himself, that because of that, there is a sense in which the rules don't really apply to you the same. That the principles of God do not apply to you in quite the same way. And this is particularly true, as I said, of people in power. This past week on 60 Minutes, Patrick Kennedy, who I believe was Ted Kennedy's youngest son, he served in the Senate for a while. But he had issues with addiction and alcoholism and also with mental health, with depression. And sometime back, after his father, Ted, died, he resigned from the Senate. He actually, one evening when he was on medication, he wrecked his car into a barricade at Capitol Hill. And of course, it was a big issue and it was in the news and everything. And he actually got up and he apologized and he came clean. He said, look, here's the deal. I'm an alcoholic and an addict. I suffer from depression. Partly my drinking is due to me self-medicating, and that's the deal. That's what's happening with me. And shortly after that, he resigned from the Senate. He's written a book here just recently entitled, I believe it was called A Common Journey. And he chronicles his family's history and all of the tragedy that has taken place within his family. And one of the things he said, actually on 60 Minutes last week, he said we had a lot of tragedy in our family. He said, first, President Kennedy was assassinated. Within 5 years, his other uncle, Bobby was assassinated. And so this was Ted Kennedy. This is his two brothers. So both of his brothers were assassinated. And, he said, of course, what you had to do in our family, what was expected was that you held your head up high, that you were stoic, that none of this was destroying you, none of this was eating you up. And there was almost a code of silence. He said, but I watched as this just ate away at my father over the years. And he said, my father would drink, and he drank very, very heavily. And of course, all of this, we didn't talk about this kind of thing. We didn't talk about when Dad would get drunk. He said, my mother was a full-blown alcoholic. She would walk around, in a terry cloth robe for all day long. And we had senators and congressmen coming to our house. And when they would come to our house, they would recognize, he said he would feel this embarrassment as a child because they would see his mother drunk. And he said, I would be embarrassed, but there was this code of silence in Washington. They just didn't talk about these things. They kept these things quiet. They just didn't talk about them. And he said, one day, he said, late actually into his father's life, his father's drinking had gotten really bad. And he said there finally came a point where him and the kids and the extended Kennedy family actually came to him, and they had a sort of intervention right there in their home. And they said, Dad, look, we're really worried about your drinking. It's getting out of hand at this point. We're really worried about you. And he said that his father listened quietly and without saying a word, got up and walked out of the room. He later sent a letter to his son Patrick and presumably all the other kids that said, don't think about visiting for a while. He said that the reality was that his father was in a place in his life where that he felt that he had done so much good. He had fought for justice. He had fought for what he believed was right his whole life, and he suffered for it. So did his brothers. Both of his brothers were assassinated for good causes that they stood for. And that he fought for goodness and righteousness and all of these things. And so he was in a place in his life that for these kids of his and his extended family to come to him, the patriarch of the family, and tell him about his drinking was an insult to his pride. Who were they to tell me, a world leader, and maybe in his own mind, one of the greatest senators ever, to tell me about my drinking? Who are they to do this? You see, pride wells up in people when they feel that they've done great things. And pride wells up in us when we feel that, hey, I attend church. I'm a good person. I do the right thing. I have integrity. There is a certain pride that wells up in us. It's almost as though we feel that God owes us something. And there is a sense that says, the rules don't quite apply to me exactly the same as they do everybody else. Now, on a side note, let me just say this to you. All of that business in Washington, and I applaud Patrick Kennedy. He's written a book that's made the whole family mad at him because he's shared the dirty laundry. And what he says is he says, look, you know what? And this is a truism. He says, secrets destroy. Secrets destroy. But let me tell you something, and this is a side note. This is something about, this was David. He was the leader of this nation. And something that we should know about the leaders of our nation is that they are both good and bad. And the thing that we do as the American people is we put this standard on them that says that they basically have to be perfect. That's what we do. And any time we can find any chink at all in their armor, we rip them apart. And so what happens as a result of that is that they are in a position where that they feel like I cannot say anything about my family or the struggles that I'm having in my life. If I'm honest about that, I will get ripped apart in the media, especially during my campaigns. My opponent will exploit that and rip me apart in the media, and the American people will be happy to join in with it. So I have to remain silent, and I have to lie about it. And of course, they all feel this way. And so what we as the American people do is, because we refuse to recognize that they're human, what we do is we put them in a position where they're almost forced to lie to us. Because if they feel that they can do some good in the world, but they know that their opponent's going to lie about all of their issues, And if they don't lie, all that will happen, if they have enough integrity to come clean and tell the truth, all that will happen is that we, the American people, will elect the one who's the liar and not them. And they're right about that. That's exactly what we would do. One journalist says that politicians can get away with saying anything because the American people know nothing. He's right. And what we as Americans ought to start doing is start saying, look, you know what? Here's the thing. We want you to be honest. Here's the deal we'll make with you. You be honest about your shortcomings and we'll forgive you for them. That would be a better deal to make. Because as long as we say, hey, everyone's got to be perfect, here's what's going to happen. They're all going to lie to us, and the only ones who ever get elected are the ones who lie to us. That's right, the ones who lie to us the most. So let's not pretend that we don't play a part in the leadership that we have in this country right now. We do. One man once said, in a democracy, the people always get the government that they deserve. And he's right. People are both good and bad. But here is what happened with David. David decided that the rules didn't apply to him. And now here's what happens. When you get to that place where that you feel that you now have to keep a secret. You know, I've got to keep a secret now. I've done something bad. I've done something evil. But I cannot bear to share that. I cannot bear, my pride cannot stand for anybody to see my dirty laundry or to see my shortcoming. Here's then the next temptation that comes. All right, here's the big one. Here's where Satan really gets in, because now you have to cover that up. And in covering that up, the temptation is to do a far greater evil in covering it up. In covering it up. David had an affair with another man's wife, and he used his power to do that. That's wrong, and it's deplorable. It's been happening since the beginning of time, though. But then to cover it up, he had a man who was loyal to him and fought for him. He had him murdered. That's what happens when we get to a place where our pride, because we're passionate, we are good people, we're righteous people, when we get to a place where that we think that we're above the rules, and when we break the rules and there are consequences for them, and we feel that nobody can see that, then we fall into the trap of deception, of putting up a facade, of lies, of secrets. And let me tell you, secrets do destroy. Catholics are right. Confession is good for the soul. It's good for the soul. Keep short accounts. Be honest about your shortcomings. Tell the truth when you make mistakes. Keep short accounts, because we're all sinners. And God calls us to love one another through our sins and to forgive one another, because that's what he does. So accept the forgiveness and give it. Pray with me. Heavenly Father, Lord, I thank you for the wisdom that is in your word, Lord. I thank you that your word does not keep secrets, Lord, that it does not whitewash the people, your people that you chose, Lord. Every step of the way we see in Scripture how the people you